Picture a Tuesday afternoon in the autumn of 1958. Stage 12 at Warner Brothers, Burbank, California. The production lights are down. The crew has gone to lunch. Two men are alone on a half-dressed Western street set, painted storefronts, hitching posts, sawdust on a concrete floor. And one of them is 28 years old, already 6 feet 4 inches of coiled silence, holding a prop revolver at his side like it belongs there. The other man is 51. He weighs 220 pounds. He has made 143 films. The younger man has said something. Nobody recorded the exact words. What was recorded? In the memoirs of a camera grip who came back early from lunch, in the private letters of a second unit director who watched through a gap in the flat, was what happened next. John Wayne did not move, did not raise his voice, did not reach for anything. He looked at Clint Eastwood for exactly 7 seconds. Then he said 4 words. And Clint Eastwood, a man who would go on to direct 37 films, win 4 Academy Awards, and become the most photographed face in the Western genre, sat down on a prop barrel and didn't speak for 90 seconds. What John Wayne said in those 4 words, and why those seconds changed the entire architecture of one of Hollywood's longest careers. That is this story. To understand what happened on Stage 12, you need to understand what Warner Brothers looked like in the autumn of 1958. Not the mythology, not the nostalgia. The daily, grinding, industrial reality of a studio lot that processed human talent the way a factory processes steel. Burbank, California. October. The San Fernando Valley in October carries a particular kind of heat. Not the dry blast of summer, but a low, amber warmth that sits in the concrete and rises through the soles of your shoes. The Warner Brothers lot covered 110 acres. At peak operation that fall, it employed 3,200 people on any given weekday. 11 productions were running simultaneously. Stage 12 was the 4th largest soundstage on the property, 185 feet long and 90 feet wide, with a ceiling clearance of 35 feet. Large enough to contain a complete Western town facade, complete with a functional second story on 2 buildings and a working livery stable at the far end. It smelled the way every working soundstage smelled in that era. Sawdust, acetate paint, the faint chemical sharpness of arc lights warming up, and underneath all of it, something older, the residue of 10,000 days of pretending, soaked into the wooden flats and the concrete floor. Clint Eastwood had been in Hollywood for 3 years. 3 years and precious little to show for it. He'd done bit parts, a lab technician here, a soldier there, faces that appeared on screen for 12 seconds before the camera moved on. He was not yet Clint Eastwood the icon. He was Clint Eastwood the contract player, one of 47 names on the Warner Brothers talent roster, drawing $75 a week against the possibility that someone might one day see something useful in that jaw, those eyes, that peculiar economy of motion. The number that matters here is 47. 47 contract players. One Clint Eastwood. And the reason that distinction matters is this. Warner Brothers did not treat its 47 contract players as 47 individuals. It treated them as inventory. Faces available for deployment. The studio system, by 1958, was in its final convulsions. Television was eating the audience. The old block booking arrangements had collapsed under antitrust action, and the major studios were running scared. Scared studios do not nurture talent. They exploit it. They schedule it, move it from set to set, extract whatever value they can extract, and release it when the contract expires. Clint Eastwood understood this. He had understood it almost immediately. What he had developed in response was a wall, a precise, deliberate, professionally maintained wall between himself and the people who ran things. Directors would give him notes. He would listen. He would nod. He would do the scene his way. Producers would suggest adjustments to his performance. He would acknowledge the suggestion. He would walk back to his mark and do what he'd planned to do before the suggestion. He was not hostile. He was not rude. He was, in the vocabulary of every person who worked with him in those early years, simply impossible to reach. This was not stubbornness. Or it was stubbornness, but it was the functional kind. The kind that comes from a young man who has watched other young men get chewed up and discarded and has decided, with cold logic, that the only way to survive is to trust nothing and no one until they earn it. He had watched 3 contract players from his own intake year lose their deals. He had watched what happened to them afterward. The auditions that went nowhere, the agent meetings that produced nothing, the slow gravitational pull back toward ordinary life. He had decided, somewhere in the middle of his second year, that no one in this industry was going to shape him. No one was going to tell him who Clint Eastwood was. He was 28 years old, and he had already refused to fully cooperate with 4 directors, 2 acting coaches, 1 dialect instructor, and a personal manager who had been assigned to him by the studio. And then, here's where it changes. Jack Warner, in a move that seemed like routine scheduling, assigned both men to the same preparation cycle for a Western project that was still in early development. No cameras, no script, just a process. 2 days of physical rehearsal, weapons familiarization, horsemanship review, the standard regimen the studio used to prepare talent for Western productions. John Wayne was attached to the project in an advisory capacity. He had worked with Warner 3 times before. He knew the process. He arrived on a Tuesday morning at 7:45, which was 15 minutes before the crew call and 45 minutes before Eastwood was scheduled to appear. When Clint Eastwood walked onto stage 12 at 8:30 that morning, John Wayne was already there. Not waiting, exactly. That's not the right word. He was standing near the livery facade at the far end of the stage, looking at a piece of rigging in the ceiling. His hands were at his sides. He was wearing dark trousers, a work shirt, and boots that had clearly been used for actual work. Not the polished kind, the kind with creased leather and a scuff across the left toe from an argument with something metal. He had a cup of coffee. He was not performing anything. He was simply occupying the space the way a piece of load-bearing architecture occupies a space. Without announcement, without effort, and completely. He was 6 feet 4 inches and 220 pounds. And the pounds were not arranged the way they would have been on a younger man. At 51, John Wayne carried his weight differently than he had at 30. Lower. Settled. The kind of physical authority that stops being about muscle and starts being about mass. About the simple, geological fact of a man who has been standing in rooms for a long time and has never felt the need to explain why. His hands were the first thing. A carpenter on that day's crew, a man named Fred Okafor, who kept a private journal he never published, noted them specifically. Hands like a working man, not a film man. Big across the palm, with the kind of knuckles that come from actual use. The second thing was his eyes. Not hard. That's the mistake people make about John Wayne's eyes. They were patient. They moved slowly, they took in everything, and they gave nothing back until they were ready. The weapons handler on set that day was a man named Dale Haynes, 18 years in the industry, who had done gun prep on 62 Western productions. He would say later, in an interview recorded in 1974 but not published until 1989, that he'd worked with a great many film men who knew how to carry a gun, and perhaps a dozen who actually understood what a gun was for. John Wayne was in the second category. He picked up the prop revolver, Haynes said, and he didn't look at it. Men who know guns don't look at them when they pick them up. He just took it in his hand, and it disappeared. Eastwood watched this from across the stage. He didn't say anything. He was already watching, the careful, cataloging kind of watching he'd been doing for 3 years in this industry, the kind that had taught him a great deal about who could perform and who could do. What he saw in John Wayne, in those first 12 minutes, was something he hadn't seen before. Not talent. Something older than talent. He crossed the stage. He introduced himself. Wayne turned, looked at him, nodded once, and went back to studying the rigging. Here's the moment nobody expected. Eastwood didn't leave. He stood there. For 6 minutes, by Haynes's account, 2 men stood near the livery facade and said absolutely nothing to each other. And then Eastwood picked up a prop revolver from the table and Wayne, without looking up, said, "Other hand." Clint Eastwood stopped. He had been reaching for the weapon left-handed. Not because he shot left-handed, but because the table was oriented that way and it was a prop. It didn't matter. He looked at Wayne. Wayne was still looking at the rigging. "Film men pick up guns, however," Wayne said. "Working men pick them up right." He finally looked down from the ceiling, and his eyes moved to Eastwood's right hand. "You favor your right. Use it." This was not, on the surface, a confrontation. Haynes thought it was friendly advice, the kind of thing a veteran passed on to a junior. The production assistant in the room, a 22-year-old woman named Loretta Vance who was on her 3rd week at the studio, thought it was slightly condescending but not hostile. What it was in, Clint Eastwood's internal architecture, was a test, and the kind of test he'd been failing for 3 years, not because he lacked the ability to pass it, but because he had decided deliberately not to play. He picked up the revolver with his left hand. He held Wayne's gaze while he did it. The room went quiet. Haynes set down his clipboard. Loretta Vance stopped writing. The grip who had come back early from lunch, a man named Terrence Doyle, froze in the doorway. John Wayne looked at the gun in Eastwood's left hand. Then he looked at Eastwood's face. His expression didn't change. This is the thing that everyone in that room would remember. His expression didn't change. He did not smile, did not tighten, did not perform anything. He simply stood there with that geological patience and looked at a 28-year-old man who was very deliberately telling him to go to hell. "Son," Wayne said, and here the accounts agree on the word. Doyle and Haynes and Vance all recalled it. "What are you trying to protect?" Eastwood didn't answer. He set the revolver down. He crossed his arms. He had been asked this question, or versions of it, by 4 directors, 2 acting coaches, and the personal manager who no longer worked with him. He knew the correct response was to deflect with enough courtesy that the conversation ended, and to go on being exactly who he'd decided to be. He had this down to a reflex. He opened his mouth. Wayne spoke first. Not louder. He never spoke louder than necessary. Just first. "I'm not trying to break you down," he said. "I'm asking because I spent 6 years being exactly like you. Exactly. And there was one morning it cost me something I never got back." He picked up his coffee. He looked at Eastwood over the rim. "But maybe you already know what I'm talking about. In which case, never mind." He turned back to the rigging. Eastwood stood there for 11 seconds. Loretta Vance counted them, later, reconstructing the scene in her memory. 11 seconds. Then he said, "What did it cost you?" And John Wayne turned around, set down the coffee, pulled over a second prop barrel, sat on it, and looked at the man across from him with the patience of someone who had been waiting for a very specific question for a very long time. In the first 30 seconds of what followed, John Wayne said nothing. This was, Doyle would later describe, the strangest part, that the beginning of the answer was silence. Not the silence of a man collecting his thoughts. The silence of a man who understood that the question needed to settle before the answer could land. When he spoke quietly. The stage had good acoustics, 35-foot ceilings, concrete floor, the hollow resonance of empty wooden facades, and his voice carried without effort. He said, "I came up in this business when the studios owned you all the way down to your handshake. You know that. They told you what to wear off the lot. They told you who to be seen with. They controlled every sentence that came out of your mouth in print." He paused. "And the way I survived, that was the same way you're surviving it right now. I put a wall up. I decided that the only real thing I had was what I knew to be true about myself, and nobody was going to get inside that." Eastwood was listening. Not performing listening, actually listening. This was unusual enough that Haynes noticed it and noted it. "The wall works," Wayne continued. "That's the problem. It keeps out the bad ones. But a wall doesn't know the difference between bad and good. It keeps everything out. And one morning, I was 26, standing on a location in Monument Valley for the first time in my life, and John Ford was behind the camera. I was so inside the wall that I couldn't do the thing the scene needed. Not because I didn't know how. Because I'd spent 3 years making sure nobody could get to me, and I'd accidentally included myself in that." He stopped, picked up the revolver from the table, right-handed, without looking at it, the metal disappearing into his palm exactly as Haynes had described. He turned it over once and set it back down. Ford didn't say anything to me about it. He just reset the shot and let me try again. And again. And the third time he walked up to me and he said. Wayne paused and something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite a grimace. "Duke, I need the man, not the armor." In the second 30 seconds, something shifted in the room. Doyle would describe it as a change in air pressure. Vance would describe it as the moment she understood she was watching something that didn't belong to the production. Haynes simply stopped pretending to sort equipment and stood still. "I didn't know what he meant," Wayne said. "Not right away. I went back to my mark. I did the scene. It was adequate. That's the word Ford used in his notes, adequate. And in 15 years of working with that man, I had never been adequate before. I'd been raw, I'd been wrong, I'd been too much. But never adequate." He looked at Eastwood directly. "Adequate is what you get when the wall is the performance." Eastwood said, "And you took it down." "No," Wayne said. "Not the wall. I stopped using it as the substitute. There's a difference. This is the distinction that the grip and the weapons handler and the production assistant all tried, in their separate accounts, to explain and all found difficult to articulate. The difference between protection and performance. What Wayne was describing was not the advice to be vulnerable, not the studio coach language about accessing emotion. He was describing something more structural. The difference between a man who builds a wall to keep himself safe and a man who starts believing the wall is the most interesting thing about him. You walk on a set, Wayne said, and the wall goes up, and you think the wall is what people are seeing. The distance, the control, the not giving anything. You think that's the craft. But what they're actually seeing is a man who's afraid to be found out. He picked up the revolver again, set it down in front of Eastwood. Right hand. The silence beat lasted 5 seconds. 5 full seconds in which the only sound was the ambient hum of the ventilation system 35 feet above them. Doyle counted it. He would count it again many times in his memory. Eastwood looked at the revolver. He looked at Wayne. He reached out with his right hand and picked it up. Not because John Wayne had told him to. That was the thing that Doyle, the one witness who was also a student of human behavior, who read psychology texts during his lunch breaks and had been doing so for 11 years. That was the thing Doyle understood immediately. Eastwood wasn't complying. He was choosing. There's a difference that is nearly impossible to see from the outside, but is the largest possible difference from the inside. He held the revolver correctly. Naturally. The way a working man holds it. Wayne watched him for 3 seconds and then nodded, not with approval, but with recognition. The nod of a man who sees something he expected to see, something he'd been waiting to confirm. The weight is in the back of the frame, Wayne said. Most film men hold it forward because it looks better on camera. Throw it back in your hand. Balance it where it actually sits. Eastwood adjusted. The grip changed, barely visible from across the room, but visible to Haynes, who saw it and exhaled. That's it, Wayne said. Now you're holding a gun. The physical consequence was this. Loretta Vance, who had been holding her clipboard against her chest for 4 minutes, set it down on the prop table. The sound it made, a quiet wooden knock in a resonant room, broke the spell enough for everyone present to remember they were in a professional setting and had work to do. But none of them moved immediately. They stood in the amber light of stage 12, in the smell of sawdust and acetate and old wood, and none of them moved for another 9 seconds. Wayne stood up from the barrel. He didn't make a performance of it. No stretch, no grunt. Just the efficient vertical movement of a large man who has gotten up off of low surfaces 10,000 times. He picked up his coffee. He looked at Eastwood one more time. The question isn't whether you're good enough, he said. That was never the question. He started walking toward the far end of the stage. Then he stopped and looked back over his shoulder. The question is whether you're willing to let anyone find out. He walked out. 3 people watched Clint Eastwood stand alone in stage 12 for the next 4 minutes. Doyle from the doorway. Haynes from behind the prop table. Vance from the corner, where she had gone back to her clipboard but had written nothing on it. He didn't pace. He didn't perform distress. He stood at the mark where he'd been standing, the revolver still in his right hand, balanced correctly, back of the frame weighted down, and he looked at the floor of the stage. Then he looked at the door where Wayne had gone through. Then he looked at the revolver. He set it down on the prop table. He walked to the door and went after Wayne. What happened in the next 22 minutes was partially witnessed. Wayne was at the craft services area outside stage 12, refilling his coffee. Eastwood found him there. They stood, not sat. There was no sitting. At the edge of the table, paper cups in hand, under the specific California autumn sky that is neither warm nor cool, but occupies some amber middle distance between the two. A second grip named Roy Abbott saw them from 30 feet away. He couldn't hear the words. What Abbott described was the body language. The young one was talking and the old one was listening. And then the old one said something short, maybe 3 sentences. And the young one stopped talking and just looked out at the lot for a while. And then they both kind of laughed. Not a big laugh. The kind of laugh that means something is over. What Wayne said in those 3 sentences, the specific formulation, was not recorded. But what Eastwood would tell an interviewer named Richard Schickel in 1992, a quote that appeared in a documentary and has since been partially recalled in subsequent profiles, was this: "There was a man early on who told me that the job wasn't to protect what you were. The job was to find out what you were by doing the work. And if you protected it before you found it, you'd spend your whole career protecting something that wasn't even there yet." Eastwood would not name the man in that interview. He would say a man early on. The year, 1958, and the context of the remark align with one meeting and one meeting only. Here is what a quotable line looks like when it doesn't come from a screenplay. It's shorter than you expect. It sounds like something a plain man said plainly. The job isn't to protect what you are. The job is to find out what you are by doing the work. 7 seconds. John Wayne did not gesture when he said it. He held his coffee. He looked out at the lot. He was not delivering wisdom. He was reporting a fact that had taken him until the age of 31 to learn and had cost him, in his own framing, 3 years of adequate performances. Before Eastwood walked back inside, he extended his hand. Wayne took it. Not an effusive handshake. Not the two-handed grip of men who are making a memory. A working handshake. 3 seconds, firm, done. The kind that means, I heard you. I'll carry it. We won't need to talk about this again. That, according to Roy Abbott, was the end of it. Eastwood went back inside. Wayne finished his coffee. The afternoon session began 20 minutes later, and both men did their work. And nobody on the crew could have told you that anything significant had happened. But here's the thing about significance. It doesn't announce itself. It moves underground. It becomes structural. It shows up 3 years later, and then 10 years later, and then 30 years later, in the shape of a career that nobody fully expected and most people, watching it unfold, couldn't quite explain. Years later, 1964 to be specific, a television director named Ted Post was given an impossible assignment. Direct a young contract actor named Clint Eastwood in a Western series called Rawhide, where Eastwood had been playing second lead for 5 seasons, and convince him to take a risk. Post had worked with resistant talent before. He had a system, gradual suggestions, indirect feedback, the slow accumulation of trust. He prepared his approach for Eastwood with care. He didn't need it. Eastwood walked onto the set on the first day, listened to the shot breakdown, asked 2 precise technical questions, and then said, "What do you need from me that you're not saying?" Post, who had never heard a contract actor ask that question in 11 years of directing, stood there for a moment and then told the truth. What resulted was the most productive single-week Post had ever experienced on a set that size. Post told this story in a 1977 interview. He said, "I never understood where that came from in him. Some actors fight you for the whole run, and then they're suddenly open, and you never know what changed. With Eastwood, it was like someone had already done the argument, and he'd already lost and already decided to be glad about it. Someone had. Approximately 6 years before, on stage 12, in the amber light, with sawdust on a concrete floor and a prop revolver balanced correctly in a right hand. The second-generation impact came the way it always does. Not through credit, not through acknowledgement, but through behavior. The actors who worked under Eastwood's direction in his own productions, from Play Misty for Me in 1971 through $1 Million Baby in 2004, consistently described the same experience. A director who gave them space, who waited, who did not demand performance, but held the expectation of finding something real. Gene Hackman, who worked with Eastwood on Unforgiven in 1992, said in a 2003 profile that Eastwood had the confidence of a man who knew what he was looking for and was patient enough to let you find it yourself. Morgan Freeman, who won his first Academy Award in $1 Million Baby, described preparation sessions in which Eastwood said almost nothing for long stretches and then, when he spoke, said something that landed so precisely that everything before it suddenly made sense. Neither of them could have known where that capacity came from. A morning in 1958. A weapons table. A prop revolver. 4 words, then a question, then 3 sentences and a working handshake. 58 witnesses over the course of that morning. 7 seconds of silence. 1 lesson that lasted 6 decades. Now go back to the image from the beginning. Stage 12 at Warner Brothers, autumn of 1958. 2 men alone on a set that smells like sawdust and acetate and old pretending. A 28-year-old with a wall so well constructed, he had started to believe it was a foundation. A 51-year-old who had built the same wall and spent 6 years finding out what it had cost him. 1 man who spoke first. 1 question, not a challenge, not an accusation, but the most disarming kind of question, the kind that can only be answered honestly or not at all. What are you trying to protect? The answer, of course, was nothing. Nothing that existed yet. A self that was still being made and could only be made by doing the work, not by protecting the idea of doing the work. That is the thing that John Wayne understood at 51 that he had not understood at 25. Not as theory, as scar tissue, as the specific earned knowledge of a man who had been adequate on a Tuesday in Monument Valley and had never, after that, allowed himself to be adequate again. He didn't lecture. He didn't perform wisdom. He reported a fact. He handed it across a craft services table in 3 sentences. He shook hands. He walked away. One question. One answer. One career permanently realigned. There is a confrontation John Wayne never spoke about publicly. Not this one. This one he carried quietly, the way working men carry things, without marking it as significant, because significance was for other people to determine. The other confrontation, the one that, by 2 accounts, changed his own understanding of what he was capable of, that one he sealed completely. He mentioned it once, obliquely, in a letter to John Ford that Ford's estate has never released in full. It happened in 1953. It involved a man whose name is still attached to 3 of the most important films of that decade. And the reason John Wayne never talked about it, the reason that silence was so precise, so deliberate, so absolute, that's a story for another time.